Hi, my name is S, and today I want to rant. Blockbuster movies are judged on a lot of things, and one particular aspect that always intrigues me in movies is the writing. Writers have to conceive the conversations that create the dialogue of the movie to tell a story or a narrative. And one of the movies that does this brilliantly, in my opinion at least, is V for Vendetta. The 2005 movie tells the story of fascist Britain in a fictional future based on the original comics by Alan Moore. The government coerced people to believe that security is only achievable through control. A vigilante, codenamed V, sets out to give people back their freedom, for he believes that governments should be afraid of people and not vice versa. Now, although the movie tells the story using various techniques, one of the strengths of the movie is the stark contrast in conversational depth between the characters. When V talks to Evie, his love interest in the movie, the conversations are warm, albeit poetic. They're not flirtatious, but genuinely interesting, building off the themes of freedom and fighting. As I watched the movie again, I realized how beautiful some of the conversations were, and it got me thinking. If I were to ask you, what is the single greatest conversation you've had or heard in your life, what would you say? Would it be a conversation with your partner? A conversation with your best friend? Maybe you've never heard the conversation or been part of it, but you've learned about it. Something like the conversation of Moses with God. Whatever it is, what's certain is that you've had at least several thousand conversations over your life. From the moment you could create thoughts in your mind, you've used words to create sentences to express those thoughts publicly to others. And in doing so, you've engaged in conversations. But I beg to argue that if something is so fundamental in how we as a species engage with one another, then the skill of striking an interesting conversation is something that should be sought. And a conversation can only be as engaging as the entities involved in the conversation, which is where you, my dear viewer, come in. Our generation has been given every reason so as not to appreciate true conversation. Although technology has helped keep us in touch, it's shallowed our relationships as well. Our relationships with our phones have become just as important as the relationships we have with people, if not slightly more. In extreme cases, some suffer from nomophobia, a word first used in 2008 to describe an irrational fear of being detached from one's cell phone, being addicted to the dopamine surge that follows each notification ding. But even if we aren't addicted to our phones, the fact that most of our daily texting consists of short quips, one-liners, and GIF usage has probably diluted our ability to hold a genuinely interesting conversation, something my friend Milton Wright would have argued if he were alive in 2019. In his 1936 book, The Art of Conversation, Wright argues just that. Conversation is a stimulating exchange of thoughts with an end in view. The purpose of the conversation drives it, encouraging the participants to offer their own input on the topic, and in doing so, approaching that end. Now, this end isn't necessarily one person destroying another person's argument, but each expressing his or her own thoughts on the matter in a manner that is both respectable and mature. This, according to Wright, isn't just an innate quality that some elite are privileged with, but a skill that can be taught and nurtured. As Wright aptly puts it in his book, as is the case with any art, there are underlying principles about which there is no secret. For the application of these principles, there is a certain technique, which, though flexible, is just as clear and definite as the rules which apply in music or any other of the fine or applied arts. When some of us think of interesting conversation, we tend to think of a group of people gathered around a table, their faces flushed and wide smiles spread across, much like the depictions of Emil Rau. This was a German painter who focused most of his work on rural Germany. In his painting, adequately titled The Admirers, for example, all the light in the image points towards the softly painted female sitting at the head of the table. Faces around the table are smiling, laughing, or just simply lost. This painting, titled The Hunters, again taps into your senses and makes you hear the conversation rather than just see it. Aside the man asking for a refill of his jug, all eyes in the painting point towards the man sitting at the head of the table, flailing as he shares some story about his adventures with the others on the table. Some look at him in apprehension, others in admiration. But the conversation is stimulating enough to keep all the listeners hooked on. Now, Emile was well known to beautifully paint his actors, sometimes over-romanticizing them in his work, and although these might have been very engaging hypothetical conversations, Wright would argue that argumentative discussions could and should also be considered good conversations, so as long as they do not insult or attack any of the conversers. A good conversation is not defined by how much you smile or laugh, but rather by the quality of ideas exchanged. In his dialogues, for instance, Plato describes how Socrates would argue with the people of Athens. Socrates was the protagonist of his stories, and the way he would converse with people would be through a series of questions that would effectively draw out the answers he sought from those people. Questions of this form are a way Wright describes as being an effective method for starting conversations. Socrates, however, wasn't particularly careful not to insult people with his questions, for his questions would often show people their ignorance, forcing them to regrettably succumb to his views through logic and reasoning. This, needless to say, wasn't appreciated by the people of Athens, and Jacques-Louis David's Death of Socrates might be what Wright would describe as a failed conversation. Seeking opinions, therefore, is a much more favorable approach. Ask someone what the sum of 20 and 22 is, and they will either know or not. But ask them which of the 3 Indiana Jones movies are the best, and they will be motivated to express their opinion. Asking someone's opinion, according to Wright, is asking for the product of his own mental operation, and of that he is proud. You value his reasoning powers and his judgment. This taps into the basic instincts, encouraging them to partake in the conversation. These instincts are attraction, self-assertion, and curiosity. Get someone to feel any of these and there's a very high chance you'll have a conversation started. Find out what intrigues a person and get them to rant their opinion about it. But once the conversation is started, your skill as a converser lies in finding a topic interesting enough to keep the dialogue engaging. Now, there are myriad topics to dive into, but your skill lies in trying to fish for the topic that gets the person to talk. As tough as this might be at times, a great way to make people enjoy your company is by actually getting them to talk about themselves. This shouldn't come as a surprise. At some point, humans believed that they were the center of the universe. So a little bit of self-centrism is not surprising. In a rather interesting test, psychologists at the University of Harvard asked participants to talk about themselves and talk about others, and noted the response in the different regions of their brains. The results of the study concluded that people like talking about themselves, their lives, their work, their children, their partners, their hobbies. Get a person to talk about themselves, and they'll like you much more by the time they're done. Although I do have my own personal critiques to Wright's book, it does offer a number of avenues worth considering in conversations. If you, my dear viewer, feel like you want to improve the quality of your conversation, then maybe you should give his book a read. But here are some thoughts before we wrap up. When something becomes too familiar, we can forget the pleasure we can reap out of it. Conversations, the basis of social interactions of social organisms for dozens of millennia, have probably fallen between the cracks of this fast-paced world. But perhaps conversations aren't meant to be rushed. Perhaps the strength of the conversation lies in the fact that a proper conversation, a true one, makes you forget that you are in a hurry. It makes you lose track of time. It's not a matter of speaking slowly, but selectively choosing your words and enjoying how those words are received by the person you're conversing with. It truly is an art, and one that should be enjoyed by all. As this episode comes to an end, I want you to imagine this with me. You're somewhere warm. The soft motion of the waves on the shore of the beach hums in the background. You can hear the seagulls in the distance. And in front of you is someone you would love to spend time with. You look at each other and a jolt rushes through you. A sensation that you want to share everything with this person. You want to tell them about all that's been going on in your life. And you don't want to leave. You want to keep on talking and listening till it gets dark. If you've never felt that, if you've never felt like you don't want to leave someone you're sitting with, then maybe, just maybe, you haven't had a proper conversation in a long time. And even though I don't know you, I'm sure you deserve to enjoy one. Thanks for listening to my rant. Till next time, S.